Confucius did not found a religion. He did not claim divine revelation. He did not write a sacred book. And yet, more than 2,000 years after his death, his ideas still govern how over 1 billion people think about family, power, morality, education, and life itself. Empires rose and collapsed. Dynasties burned. Philosophies vanished. But Confucius endured. Here is the paradox that makes Confucius one of the most fascinating figures in human history. He was a man who failed almost everything he tried to do while alive, yet became one of the most influential thinkers ever after he died. He wanted political power. He wanted to reform governments. He wanted to advise kings and reshape society. He was rejected, mocked, ignored, often poor, often unemployed, often wandering. And yet today, entire civilizations still breathe according to rules he articulated. So who was Confucius really? Was he a conservative moralist clinging to tradition? A revolutionary thinker disguised as a traditionalist? A failed politician turned accidental philosopher? Or the architect of a moral system that quietly shaped East Asia more deeply than any conqueror ever could? To understand Confucius, we must first understand the world that was collapsing around him. Confucius was born in 551 BCE, during a period in Chinese history known as the Spring and Autumn period, a deceptively gentle name for an era defined by chaos, violence, and moral decay. The old order was disintegrating. The Zhou dynasty still existed in name, but real power had fractured into dozens of rival states. Nobles betrayed nobles. Rulers assassinated rulers. Wars were constant, brutal, and often pointless. Laws changed depending on who held power that week. Loyalty meant nothing. Honor was negotiable. Society, in Confucius's eyes, had lost its moral backbone. This matters because Confucius was not born into comfort or privilege. His father, a military officer, died when Confucius was only 3 years old. His mother raised him alone, in poverty. He grew up on the margins of the aristocracy, educated enough to understand elite culture, but excluded from real power. This position shaped him profoundly. Confucius was close enough to power to see how it worked, and far enough from it to see how broken it was. As a child, he showed an unusual obsession with ritual. Other children played games. Confucius reenacted ceremonies. He arranged objects as if they were ceremonial vessels. He practiced formal bows. He memorized songs, poems, and ancient rites. This was not childish play. It was early philosophy. Confucius believed that ritual was not empty tradition. It was the invisible structure that taught people how to behave when no one was watching. To him, the collapse of society was not primarily political. It was moral. People no longer knew how to act as fathers, sons, rulers, or citizens. So Confucius made a radical choice. Instead of trying to overthrow the system, instead of preaching rebellion, instead of calling for divine intervention, he attempted something far more difficult. He tried to rebuild civilization from the inside out. Confucius believed that if individuals could be morally cultivated, society would naturally stabilize, not through fear, not through punishment, but through character. This belief directly contradicted many thinkers of his time, who argued that people were inherently selfish and required strict laws and harsh penalties. Confucius disagreed. He believed people were morally improvable, but only through education, discipline, and example. This led to one of the most revolutionary ideas in ancient history. Confucius taught anyone who was willing to learn. Not just nobles, not just elites, anyone. In a rigidly stratified society, this was quietly subversive. Education had been a privilege of birth. Confucius transformed it into a moral pursuit. He accepted students who could barely pay, sometimes accepting dried meat as tuition. He did not lecture. He questioned. He did not provide answers. He provoked self-examination. Many of the most famous Confucian teachings were never written by him at all. They were recorded by his students decades later in a text known as the Analects. And here is another irony. Confucius constantly claimed that he was not inventing anything new. "I transmit, I do not create," he said. Yet everything he transmitted was transformed. He redefined what it meant to be a gentleman. He redefined leadership. He redefined virtue. For Confucius, a ruler's legitimacy did not come from bloodline or force. It came from moral authority. A ruler who lacked virtue, no matter how powerful, was unfit to rule. This idea would later become the foundation of the Mandate of Heaven, one of the most powerful political concepts in Chinese history. And yet, during his lifetime, Confucius never successfully implemented his vision. He served briefly in minor government roles, but political intrigue always pushed him aside. At one point, he and his students wandered from state to state, seeking a ruler willing to listen. They were often humiliated, sometimes threatened, sometimes nearly killed. Confucius once admitted that he felt like a strayed dog. This is the image history rarely shows you. Confucius as a wandering intellectual, aging, frustrated, and aware that his vision might die with him. But it didn't. Because Confucius was not building an institution, he was shaping minds. And long after his death, those minds would reshape empires. At the center of Confucius' entire worldview is a single idea so simple that it almost sounds naive, and so demanding that most people never truly live up to it. That idea is Ren. Ren is often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or human-heartedness. But none of these words fully capture what Confucius meant. Ren is not kindness in the sentimental sense. It is not generosity as charity. It is not passive goodness. Ren is the active discipline of becoming fully human in relation to others. Confucius believed that a person does not become moral by memorizing rules. They become moral by learning how to treat other people correctly, moment by moment, role by role. A son must learn how to be a son. A father must learn how to be a father. A ruler must learn how to be a ruler. A friend must learn how to be a friend. Morality, in Confucius' eyes, was relational, not abstract. This immediately separated him from many Western moral traditions that would emerge later. Confucius did not ask, "What is the universal law?" He asked, "What is the right way to act here, with this person, in this relationship?" Ren was not something you declared. It was something you practiced. And it was difficult. Confucius once described Ren in a way that shocked even his own students. He said that achieving Ren required self-conquest, not conquering others, not conquering territory, but conquering oneself. This is where Confucius becomes far more demanding than he is often portrayed. Modern caricatures present him as a gentle moral teacher, preaching harmony and obedience. But in reality, Confucius placed an almost unbearable burden on the individual. You were responsible for your character, regardless of circumstances. If society was corrupt, you were still expected to act correctly. If rulers were immoral, you were still expected to remain virtuous. If you suffered injustice, you were still expected to maintain moral dignity. This was not passive acceptance. It was moral resistance without rebellion. Confucius believed that example was more powerful than force. A virtuous person, he argued, reshapes others simply by existing correctly. A gentleman, he said, is ashamed if his words outstrip his deeds. This emphasis on internal consistency between intention, speech, and action became one of the defining features of Confucian ethics, and it terrified bad rulers. Because Confucius was not telling people to overthrow kings, he was telling them to outgrow them. Another key concept that cannot be separated from Ren is Li. Li is often translated as ritual. But again, the translation is misleading. Li includes ceremonies, etiquette, manners, social customs, and formal behaviors. But for Confucius, Li was not about blind tradition. It was about training the self through form. He believed that external behavior shapes internal character. How you speak, how you sit, how you listen, how you show respect. These were not superficial details. They were moral technologies. Confucius believed that when ritual collapses, cruelty follows. When people stop knowing how to behave respectfully, power fills the vacuum. This is why Confucius obsessed over seemingly minor details. How to mourn properly, how to greet elders, how to conduct ceremonies. To modern minds, this can feel outdated or overly rigid. But to Confucius, Li was a defense against chaos. Ritual restrained impulse. Form restrained violence. Courtesy restrained cruelty. And unlike laws, rituals worked without punishment. They worked because people internalized them. Confucius's critics accused him of nostalgia, of trying to revive a golden age that never truly existed. But Confucius never claimed the past was perfect. He believed the past contained models, not blueprints. He studied ancient kings not because they were flawless, but because they represented ideals of moral leadership. This leads to one of the most misunderstood facts about Confucius. He was not conservative in the political sense. He did not defend tradition simply because it was old. He defended tradition because it had been tested against human weakness. Confucius rejected the idea that fear creates order. He observed that harsh laws produce clever criminals, not virtuous citizens. Punishment, he believed, teaches people how to avoid getting caught, not how to become good. If you lead the people with laws, he warned, they will avoid punishment, but have no sense of shame. Shame, for Confucius, was not humiliation. It was moral awareness. A person with shame regulates themselves even when no authority is present. This is why Confucius believed education was more important than legislation. Teach people how to think, how to judge themselves, how to feel responsibility, and society would stabilize naturally. This belief would later clash violently with legalist philosophy, which argued that humans are inherently selfish and must be controlled through strict law and force. Confucius rejected this pessimism. He did not believe humans were naturally good, but he believed they were capable of goodness. And that capability mattered. Because if humans could not become better, civilization itself was an illusion. One of the most revealing facts about Confucius is how he taught. He did not give identical answers to identical questions. He tailored his responses to the character of the student. To one student, he urged caution. To another, boldness. This was not inconsistency. It was moral precision. Confucius believed teaching was not about information transfer. It was about character calibration. And yet, for all his emphasis on self-improvement, Confucius was painfully aware of his own limits. He openly admitted his failures. He admitted frustration. He admitted doubt. This humility made him human. And perhaps this is why his students preserved his words so carefully. They were not preserving the voice of a prophet. They were preserving the struggle of a man trying desperately to live up to his own ideals. Confucius never called for revolution. He never raised an army. He never incited rebellion. He never tried to seize power by force. And yet, to corrupt rulers, Confucius was far more dangerous than any rebel, because he attacked power at its source. Confucius believed that political authority did not originate from violence, wealth, or lineage. It originated from moral example. This single belief quietly undermined every ruler who lacked virtue. In the world Confucius lived in, power was inherited, seized, or negotiated through force. Loyalty was bought. Fear was maintained. Confucius looked at this system and made a devastating claim. A ruler who governs through fear is already weak. Why? Because fear disappears the moment power does. Only virtue survives. Confucius argued that the true function of a ruler was not to command, but to model. If a ruler was just, ministers would become just. If a ruler was restrained, society would become restrained. If a ruler was greedy, corruption would spread like disease. Leadership, in Confucius's framework, was contagious. This idea made tyranny, philosophically, indefensible. Confucius once compared moral leadership to the North Star. The North Star stays in its place, he said, and all the other stars revolve around it. The ruler does not chase obedience. Obedience follows naturally. This was not idealism. It was observation. Confucius saw that societies governed by cruelty required endless enforcement. Societies governed by trust required far less control. This belief directly shaped one of the most enduring political doctrines in Chinese history, the mandate of heaven. Although Confucius did not invent the concept, his moral framework gave it teeth. The mandate of heaven held that rulers governed with divine approval, but only as long as they ruled justly. Natural disasters, famines, rebellions, these were interpreted as signs that a ruler had lost moral legitimacy. This was revolutionary. It meant power was conditional. A king was not sacred by birth. He was sacred by behavior. And once behavior failed, resistance became morally justified. Confucius never endorsed rebellion explicitly, but his philosophy made blind loyalty impossible. This is why later dynasties embraced Confucianism cautiously. It stabilized society, but also imposed moral scrutiny on those at the top. Another crucial fact about Confucius is how he redefined the gentleman, or junzi. Before Confucius, a gentleman was defined by birth. You were noble because your father was noble. Confucius shattered this idea. A junzi, he argued, was defined by character, not bloodline. Anyone, regardless of origin, could become a junzi through moral cultivation. This was quietly radical. It challenged hereditary aristocracy without abolishing hierarchy. Confucius was not an egalitarian in the modern sense. He believed social roles mattered, but he believed moral worth was earned. This created a new social ideal, the scholar official, a person who ruled not because of noble birth, but because of education, discipline, and virtue. Centuries later, this idea would evolve into the imperial examination system, one of the most sophisticated merit-based bureaucracies in pre-modern history. Millions of men studied Confucian texts for centuries, believing moral excellence could elevate their social standing. No sword had ever reshaped society so slowly and so completely. And yet, Confucius himself never benefited from this transformation. He applied for positions repeatedly. He was sidelined repeatedly. At one point, he served as Minister of Justice in the state of Lu, and briefly succeeded in reducing crime and corruption. But political rivals feared his influence. They undermined him. They restored corruption. Confucius resigned. This pattern repeated throughout his life. He would be invited. He would propose reforms. He would be resisted. He would leave. His failure was consistent, but so was his integrity. Confucius refused to compromise his principles for power. This is another fact often overlooked. Confucius was ambitious. He wanted influence. He wanted authority, but he wanted them on moral terms. He refused positions that required moral compromise. He refused to serve rulers he considered corrupt. This refusal kept him poor and politically marginal, but it preserved his credibility. Confucius believed that serving an immoral ruler was itself a form of corruption. If the way does not prevail, he said, hide. Not flee in fear, but withdraw in dignity. This idea later became a core tension in Confucian political life. When should a moral person serve power? And when should they refuse it? Generations of scholars would struggle with this question. Some chose service, some chose withdrawal, some paid with their lives. Confucius offered no easy answers. He believed morality was situational, but never negotiable. One of the most revealing facts about Confucius is how he treated dissent. He did not silence disagreement. He encouraged it. He surrounded himself with students who challenged him. He debated constantly. Truth, for Confucius, emerged through dialogue, not authority. This alone separated him from authoritarian thinkers. He believed moral clarity required friction. A ruler who silenced criticism, he argued, had already failed. This belief made Confucianism a double-edged sword for emperors. It justified authority, but it also justified criticism. This is why Confucian scholars often became both the backbone of the state and its most persistent critics. They were loyal, but not obedient. This tension defined Chinese political life for 2 millennia. To understand Confucius, you must understand one uncomfortable truth. He believed politics begins in the family, not in parliaments, not in courts, not in armies, but in how children treat parents and how parents treat children. This belief is one of the most influential and controversial facts about Confucian philosophy. Confucius lived in a world where family structures were disintegrating alongside political order. Inheritance disputes were common. Loyalty was fractured. Trust eroded. He saw a direct connection between broken families and broken states. If a person could not show responsibility within the smallest social unit, how could they be trusted with greater power? This led Confucius to elevate filial piety, or xiao, to a foundational moral principle. Filial piety is often misunderstood as blind obedience to parents. Confucius did not mean that. Xiao was not submission. It was reciprocal responsibility. A child owed respect, care, and gratitude. A parent owed guidance, moral example, and restraint. Confucius openly criticized abusive or immoral parents. He argued that true filial piety sometimes required gentle resistance. A son, he said, should correct a father who is wrong, respectfully, persistently, and without humiliation. This alone contradicts the caricature of Confucius as a promoter of unquestioning hierarchy. Hierarchy, to Confucius, came with obligations in both directions. The father who abused power was not acting as a true father. The ruler who abused power was not acting as a true ruler. Roles were conditional on behavior. This is why Confucius saw family relationships as moral training grounds. Family was where people first learned patience, restraint, empathy, duty. It was where they learned how to disagree without destruction. Confucius believed a person who mastered these skills at home would naturally carry them into public life. This idea shaped East Asian societies for centuries. Respect for elders, ancestral remembrance, intergenerational responsibility. These were not sentimental traditions. They were moral infrastructure. Another important fact about Confucius is how he viewed love. He did not emphasize romantic love the way modern cultures do. This does not mean he dismissed emotion. He believed emotion must be disciplined, not denied. Uncontrolled emotion led to favoritism, jealousy, and injustice. Disciplined emotion produced stability and trust. Confucius believed the deepest form of love was not passion, but commitment, showing up, fulfilling obligations, acting correctly even when feelings wavered. This idea can feel cold to modern audiences, but in a world without strong legal systems or social safety nets, reliability mattered more than intensity. Confucius was not trying to make life exciting. He was trying to make it livable. Another rarely discussed fact is Confucius's approach to grief. He believed mourning rituals were essential, not because the dead needed them, but because the living did. Ritualized mourning gave structure to loss. It prevented grief from turning into despair or rage. Confucius famously insisted on long mourning periods for parents. This was criticized even in his own time as impractical. But Confucius believed that grief suppressed for convenience would resurface as cruelty. By honoring loss, society honored humanity. This attention to emotional regulation through ritual is one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of Confucianism. Confucius understood something modern psychology would rediscover much later. Emotions that are not given form will seek expression in destructive ways. Family rituals, therefore, were not archaic customs. They were emotional safeguards. Confucius also believed that family loyalty trained people for political loyalty, but not blind loyalty. Just as a child should correct a parent respectfully, a minister should correct a ruler. This analogy became central to Confucian political ethics. A minister who never criticized a ruler was not loyal. He was cowardly. True loyalty required moral courage. This belief produced generations of scholar officials who saw it as their duty to speak truth to power, even at personal risk. Some were exiled, some imprisoned, some executed. Confucius never encouraged martyrdom, but he accepted its possibility. He believed moral life involved risk. And here lies another key fact. Confucius did not promise happiness. He promised meaning. A meaningful life, he believed, was one lived in alignment with moral roles, even when painful. This is why Confucianism endured through war, famine, and collapse. It offered a way to live with dignity when circumstances were cruel. But Confucius was not blind to the dangers of family-based morality. He warned against nepotism. Favoring relatives at the expense of justice was a corruption of filial piety, not its fulfillment. Moral principles, he insisted, must always override personal attachment. This balance between care and fairness, loyalty and integrity, was the heart of Confucian ethics. Confucius is often described as a thinker obsessed with the past. He quoted ancient texts. He admired long-dead kings. He idealized early dynasties. To many modern readers, this makes him sound reactionary. A man clinging to traditions while the world changed around him. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings about Confucius. Confucius did not worship the past. He interrogated it. He believed the past was valuable, not because it was old, but because it contained tested solutions to recurring human problems. War, greed, arrogance, decay of trust. These problems were not new in Confucius's time, and they are not new now. Confucius believed progress without memory was reckless, and memory without adaptation was useless. This tension defined his entire philosophy. One of the most important facts about Confucius is how he treated ancient texts. He did not treat them as sacred scripture. He treated them as case studies. He studied historical records, poetry, and ritual manuals to understand how human behavior produced stability or chaos. The famous 5 classics, later canonized by Confucian tradition, were not written by Confucius. He edited, transmitted, and reinterpreted them. This editorial role mattered. Confucius shaped how future generations would read their own past. He emphasized moral lessons over myth, behavior over heroics, restraint over conquest. This reframing quietly altered cultural values. Instead of glorifying warriors, Confucius elevated moral exemplars. Instead of celebrating domination, he celebrated moderation. This shift had long-term consequences. It discouraged the romanticization of violence. It elevated civil administration over military conquest. It valued stability over expansion. Confucius believed that a society constantly chasing novelty would lose itself. But he did not believe tradition should be frozen. This is where his idea of the way, or Tao, becomes important. Confucius did not define the Tao as a cosmic force like later Taoist thinkers did. For him, the Tao was the right way to live, discovered through moral refinement and historical wisdom. The Tao was not static. It unfolded differently in different circumstances. Confucius believed that ancient sages followed the Tao because they responded correctly to their times, not because they memorized rules. This allowed Confucianism to evolve. Later thinkers would reinterpret Confucius radically while still claiming fidelity to him. This adaptability is one reason Confucianism survived when many rigid systems collapsed. Another crucial fact is Confucius's relationship with innovation. He was skeptical of radical change imposed from above. Sudden reforms, he believed, ignored human psychology. People resist what they do not understand. Instead, Confucius favored gradual transformation through education and example. Change the character of leaders. Train the habits of citizens. Let institutions evolve naturally. This approach was slow, but it was durable. Confucius understood something modern policymakers often forget. Human behavior does not change at the speed of law. It changes at the speed of habit. This belief also shaped his views on punishment. Confucius did not deny the need for law, but he believed law should be a last resort. A society that relied primarily on punishment had already failed morally. Punishment treated symptoms. Education treated causes. This did not make Confucius naive about evil. He knew cruelty existed, but he believed cruelty spread faster in systems that normalized fear. Confucius's critics accused him of idealism. They argued that humans were too selfish for moral governance. These critics would later form the legalist school, which briefly dominated Chinese politics through strict laws and severe punishments. The Qin dynasty unified China using legalist principles. It also collapsed within 15 years. Confucian scholars later pointed to this as proof that fear creates obedience, but not loyalty. Another fact often overlooked is Confucius's view of history itself. He did not believe history moved in a straight line. He believed it oscillated. Order decays, chaos rises, order returns, if moral foundations are restored. This cyclical view made Confucianism resilient during collapse. When dynasties fell, Confucian values did not disappear. They waited. Scholars preserved texts. Families preserved rituals. Communities preserved norms. When order returned, Confucianism was ready. This is why Confucius often appears more powerful after disasters than before them. His philosophy thrived in reconstruction. And here is one of the most ironic facts of all. Confucius himself believed he had failed. Late in life, he lamented that no ruler truly listened. He believed the Tao did not prevail in his time, yet history would prove him wrong. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. His influence grew not through conquest, but through education, not through fear, but through admiration, not through dogma, but through interpretation. Confucius is often presented as an abstract authority, a voice of timeless wisdom detached from ordinary life. This image is misleading. One of the most revealing facts about Confucius is how deeply human he was. He was not serene. He was not detached. He was not emotionally invulnerable. He was frustrated. He was ambitious. He was disappointed, and he admitted it. Confucius laughed often. He enjoyed music. He appreciated good food. He mourned deeply. His philosophy did not emerge from spiritual isolation. It emerged from lived experience. Confucius openly spoke about his failures. He admitted that he did not always live up to his own ideals. This honesty made his teachings persuasive. He did not claim moral perfection. He claimed moral effort. One of the most striking facts about Confucius is his attitude toward age and self-assessment. He famously described his own moral development in stages. At 15, he set his heart on learning. At 30, he stood firm. At 40, he had no more doubts. At 50, he understood heaven's mandate. At 60, his ear was attuned to truth. At 70, he could follow his heart's desires without overstepping moral bounds. This was not arrogance, it was reflection. Confucius saw moral development as a lifelong process. There was no moment of enlightenment, no final achievement, only refinement. This view made morality accessible. You did not need to be born virtuous. You needed to persist. Another important fact is Confucius' sense of humor. The Analects preserve moments where he teases students, mocks pretension, and deflates arrogance. When a student boasted about moral superiority, Confucius undercut him. When another obsessed over cleverness, Confucius reminded him that wisdom without virtue was dangerous. Confucius disliked empty eloquence. He distrusted people who spoke beautifully but acted poorly. Words to him were cheap. Character was costly. This skepticism made him an uncomfortable teacher. He challenged students constantly. He refused to flatter them. He allowed them to fail. Confucius believed struggle was essential to learning. He would not give answers until a student demonstrated effort. If a student did not wrestle with a problem, Confucius withheld guidance. This approach frustrated many, but it produced independent thinkers rather than obedient followers. Another revealing fact about Confucius is his emotional vulnerability. He formed deep attachments to certain students. When one of his favorite disciples, Yan Hui, died young, Confucius was devastated. He wept openly. He was criticized for excessive grief. He refused to apologize. This moment reveals something essential. Confucius did not believe moral discipline required emotional suppression. He believed emotion should be expressed appropriately, not erased. Grief was appropriate to loss. To deny it would be inhuman. This balance between restraint and sincerity defined his ethics. Confucius also experienced fear. During his years of wandering, he and his students were sometimes threatened by hostile states. At one point, they were surrounded and nearly starved. Confucius did not respond with heroic bravado. He worried, he doubted, but he did not abandon his principles. This quiet resilience became one of his most powerful lessons. Confucius believed courage was not fearlessness. It was steadfastness despite fear. Another humanizing fact is Confucius's relationship with ambition. He wanted recognition. He wanted influence. He wanted to be useful. His frustration at being ignored was genuine. He once lamented that no one truly understood him. This loneliness shaped his teaching. It deepened his patience. It sharpened his insights. Confucius did not retreat into bitterness. He doubled down on education. If rulers would not listen, he would teach those who might become future rulers. This long-term view was critical. Confucius did not expect quick victories. He invested in generations. This is why his influence grew after his death. Not because he was charismatic, but because his students were prepared. Another overlooked fact is Confucius' openness to correction. He admitted mistakes publicly. If a student made a better argument, Confucius acknowledged it. Authority, to him, did not mean infallibility. It meant responsibility. This attitude fostered a culture of dialogue rather than dogma. Confucius did not demand worship. He demanded effort. This is why Confucianism never developed a priesthood. There were scholars, teachers, and officials, but no intermediaries between humans and moral truth. This absence of religious hierarchy allowed Confucianism to adapt across centuries. Confucius was deeply traditional, yet personally flexible, strict in principle, yet gentle in application. This combination made him believable. And perhaps this is the most important fact of all. Confucius never claimed certainty about the afterlife. When asked about death, he redirected the question. "How can we know death," he asked, "when we don't yet understand life?" This grounded his philosophy firmly in the human world. He focused on what could be practiced now. For Confucius, learning was never about intelligence. It was about character. This single idea transformed education from a technical skill into a moral discipline, and its consequences reshaped civilization for centuries. Confucius lived in a world where education was primarily vocational. You learned rituals to perform ceremonies. You learned records to administer states. You learned military skills to fight wars. Confucius looked at this system and saw a dangerous flaw. Knowledge without moral grounding produced clever tyrants. Skill without virtue produced efficient cruelty. So he redefined learning itself. To Confucius, learning was not the accumulation of information. It was the cultivation of the self. He believed that studying poetry trained emotional sensitivity. Studying history trained moral judgment. Studying ritual trained self-restraint. Nothing was neutral. Every subject either refined character or corrupted it. This is why Confucius insisted that learning must be paired with reflection. "Learning without thought is labor lost," he said. "Thought without learning is perilous." Memorization alone produced shallow minds. Speculation alone produced arrogance. True learning required tension between discipline and insight. Another important fact about Confucius is that he rejected the idea of fixed intelligence. He did not believe people were naturally wise or foolish. He believed they were differently unfinished. This belief made education inclusive. Confucius taught students of varying abilities, backgrounds, and temperaments. He adjusted his methods accordingly. This flexibility contradicted elitist assumptions of his time. It suggested that moral excellence was not inherited, it was practiced. Confucius did not praise brilliance without humility. He distrusted cleverness, divorced from ethics. Some of his sharpest criticisms were aimed at those who learned quickly but lacked moral depth. Speed, to Confucius, was irrelevant. Direction mattered. He admired persistence more than talent. This emphasis shaped the later Confucian examination culture. Success was not measured by originality. It was measured by moral understanding and disciplined effort. This system had flaws, but it also produced something unprecedented, a vast class of educated individuals who believed moral responsibility accompanied knowledge. Confucius also believed learning never ended. There was no graduation from ethics. A ruler needed constant education. An elder needed constant reflection. A teacher needed constant self-correction. This belief undermined static authority. No one could claim final mastery. Confucius himself modeled this humility. He described himself as someone who loved learning, not someone who possessed wisdom. This posture mattered. It turned education into a shared journey rather than a hierarchy of knowing. Another critical fact is Confucius's belief that teaching was itself a moral act. A teacher was responsible not only for what students learned, but for who they became. This imposed a heavy burden. Confucius refused to teach those he believed lacked sincerity, not because they were incapable, but because they were unwilling. Learning, to him, required moral readiness. Without effort, instruction was wasted. Confucius believed teachers must lead by example. Their lives were part of the lesson. This idea profoundly shaped East Asian views of educators. Teachers were not merely instructors. They were moral references. This elevated the social status of education, while also increasing its ethical demands. Confucius also believed that questioning authority was part of learning, but questioning had to be sincere, not cynical. He discouraged argument for the sake of display. Debate, to Confucius, was a tool for clarity, not dominance. This stance produced a culture of respectful intellectual challenge. Disagreement did not imply disloyalty. Silence did not imply wisdom. Another overlooked fact is Confucius's relationship with failure in learning. He did not shame students for mistakes. He used mistakes as diagnostic tools. Errors revealed character gaps. Confucius believed failure was informative, if approached correctly. This view reduced fear. It encouraged persistence. Learning became a process of refinement rather than a performance. Confucius also emphasized joy in learning. He believed true learning was intrinsically rewarding, not because it guaranteed success, but because it aligned the learner with meaning. This joy was quiet. It did not depend on praise. It came from internal coherence. A person who learned correctly felt less fragmented. This inner harmony mattered more than external achievement. Confucius worried deeply about education that chased utility alone. He feared societies that trained people only for profit or power. Such education, he believed, hollowed out character. It created skilled individuals who lacked moral anchors. This concern feels strikingly modern. Confucius understood that knowledge amplifies intent. If intent is corrupt, knowledge magnifies damage. This is why he placed ethics at the center of learning. Confucius also believed learning created moral obligation. The more one understood, the more one was responsible. Ignorance excused mistakes. Knowledge removed excuses. This belief placed pressure on scholars. They could not retreat into private brilliance. They were expected to serve. If the world was unjust, educated people bore greater responsibility. This expectation shaped Confucian political culture for centuries. Scholars were expected to advise rulers, criticize injustice, and withdraw when morality collapsed. Learning was not escape, it was engagement. When Confucius died in 479 BCE, he did not leave behind a movement. He left behind students. No official school, no political faction, no protected legacy. He was buried simply. The world did not stop. For decades, Confucius remained a marginal figure, respected locally, largely ignored politically. This is one of the most surprising facts about Confucius's legacy. His influence began after his failure. His students preserved his words, compiled conversations, and debated his meaning. These fragments would later become the Analects. But for nearly 2 centuries, Confucianism competed with rival philosophies. Taoism mocked its moral rigidity. Legalism dismissed its optimism. Mohism criticized its ritualism. Confucianism survived not because it dominated, but because it adapted. During the Warring States period, chaos intensified. Violence escalated. States collapsed. Moral frameworks fractured. Legalism offered efficiency through fear. It worked briefly. The Qin dynasty unified China using legalist principles. It also burned books, buried scholars, and ruled through terror. Within 15 years, it collapsed. This collapse changed everything. The Han dynasty rose in its place, searching for a philosophy that could stabilize society without constant repression. They turned to Confucius. This was not pure admiration. It was pragmatism. Confucianism offered moral legitimacy, social stability, and an educational framework. But here is a critical fact. The Confucianism adopted by the Han was not identical to Confucius's original thought. It was institutionalized, systematized, simplified. Confucius became an icon. His flexible teachings hardened into doctrine. This transformation had consequences. Confucian ideals were used to justify authority as much as to restrain it. Rulers emphasized obedience more than moral example. Hierarchy became more rigid. The scholar-official class grew powerful, but also conservative. This tension defined Confucian history. Confucianism was both a tool of governance and a moral critique of power. It stabilized empires, but also challenged them. One important fact is how Confucius's image changed. He was elevated from wandering teacher to sage. Temples were built, rituals were formalized, titles were bestowed posthumously. Confucius never sought worship, but society created it. This transformation made his ideas accessible, but also froze them. Some later thinkers would rebel against this rigidity. Neo-Confucians reinterpreted Confucius through metaphysics and psychology. Others returned to original texts to recover his flexibility. Confucius became a battleground of interpretation. This is why there is no single Confucianism. There are many Confuciuses. Another key fact is how Confucianism spread beyond China. It shaped Korea, Japan, and Vietnam profoundly. Each culture adapted it differently. In Korea, Confucianism reinforced moral discipline and education. In Japan, it blended with samurai ethics. In Vietnam, it shaped bureaucracy and family structure. Confucius became a regional force without armies. His influence spread through schools, exams, and rituals. This was soft power before the term existed. Confucianism also created one of the world's longest-running meritocratic systems. The imperial examinations, based on Confucian texts, allowed social mobility. Brilliant minds from poor backgrounds could rise. This was revolutionary and exhausting. Generations memorized texts, chasing moral authority and status. The system produced a stability, but also conformity. Creativity suffered. Innovation slowed. Confucianism preserved society, but sometimes restrained it. This dual legacy remains debated. Another overlooked fact is Confucianism's resilience under attack. It survived Buddhist challenge. It survived Taoist mysticism. It survived colonial critique. It survived revolutionary rejection. Even when officially denounced, Confucian values persisted informally. Family structures, educational reverence, moral language. Confucius outlasted regimes because he embedded himself in everyday life. This is perhaps his greatest achievement. He shaped how people treated parents, teachers, rulers, and themselves. Even when rejected intellectually, he endured culturally. Confucius also became a symbol of Chinese identity. At times he was celebrated, at times condemned as backward, but he was never irrelevant. This persistence raises an uncomfortable question. Was Confucius right, or was he simply useful? The answer may be both. Confucius offered tools for moral life. Societies use those tools according to their needs, sometimes to elevate, sometimes to control. Confucius himself anticipated this danger. He warned against ritual without sincerity, against learning without reflection, against authority without virtue. Whether societies listened was never guaranteed. No thinker influences civilization for 2,000 years without attracting serious criticism. Confucius is no exception. In fact, some of the most important facts about Confucius emerge not from praise, but from the arguments against him. Critics have accused Confucianism of promoting conformity over creativity, hierarchy over equality, obedience over freedom, stability over progress. These critiques are not baseless. They are rooted in how Confucianism was historically applied. But to understand whether Confucius himself deserves blame, we must separate the philosophy from its institutional use. Confucius believed in hierarchy, but not in moral inequality. He believed roles differed, but moral responsibility was universal. This distinction is crucial. Confucius never argued that rulers were morally superior by birth. He argued the opposite. Those with power bore greater ethical burden. Yet, when Confucianism became state ideology, this nuance was often lost. Hierarchy hardened. Obedience was emphasized. Moral critique softened. This distortion fueled later backlash. During periods of rapid change, Confucianism was blamed for stagnation. Reformers argued that reverence for tradition smothered innovation. Revolutionaries accused Confucian ethics of sustaining oppression. These critiques gained force in the modern era. As China encountered industrialized Western powers, Confucianism was framed as a barrier to modernization. Education based on memorization was criticized. Family loyalty was blamed for nepotism. Ritual was mocked as empty formality. Confucius became a symbol of the past, whether fair or not. Yet another fact complicates this narrative. Confucius himself warned against ritual without understanding. He despised mechanical obedience. He valued sincerity over form. He encouraged criticism of immoral authority. These ideas were inconvenient to centralized power. They were often ignored. Confucius also never opposed science, technology, or experimentation. He simply lived before them. What he opposed was innovation without ethical grounding. This concern remains relevant. Technological progress without moral reflection has repeatedly produced disaster. Confucius would not have rejected change. He would have asked, who benefits? Who suffers? What kind of people does this create? These questions are not conservative. They are ethical. Another major criticism targets Confucius's views on gender. Historically, Confucian societies were patriarchal. Women were restricted. Roles were rigid. But here is a critical fact. Confucius said almost nothing explicit about women. The strict gender codes, often attributed to him, emerged later. They were shaped by social conditions, not philosophical necessity. This does not absolve Confucianism of responsibility. Ideas shape societies. Silence can enable injustice. But it does complicate claims that Confucius personally designed gender oppression. Later, Confucians codified norms that reflected their time. Confucius's core ethics, Ren, moral self-cultivation, relational responsibility, do not inherently exclude women. Another critique argues that Confucianism discourages individuality. Confucius valued harmony, but harmony, to him, did not mean uniformity. It meant coordination, different voices properly tuned. Confucius criticized those who sought difference for its own sake, but he also criticized those who conformed mindlessly. The ideal Confucian individual was not a clone. It was a cultivated self, aware of context. This nuance often vanished in bureaucratic application. Institutions favor predictability. Confucian ethics became tools of order. Order became habit. Habit became rigidity. This cycle was not unique to Confucianism. It afflicts all successful ideas. Another overlooked fact is Confucius's relationship with rebellion. He never endorsed violent overthrow. This frustrates modern revolutionaries. But Confucius believed moral decay preceded political collapse. Fix character first. Power will follow. History offers mixed evidence. Sometimes reform works, sometimes it fails. Confucius accepted this uncertainty. He did not promise guaranteed outcomes. He offered a way to live with dignity, regardless of outcome. This is perhaps his most controversial legacy. Confucius prioritized ethical integrity over historical speed. He would rather be right slowly than wrong quickly. In an age obsessed with disruption, this patience feels alien, but it also feels necessary. Confucius does not tell us how to win. He tells us how to remain human while trying. Confucius died over 2,000 years ago. Yet today, his ideas continue to shape societies, governments, schools, and families. How is this possible? One of the most striking facts about Confucius is the timelessness of his moral framework. He lived in a fragmented world, ruled by corruption, war, and chaos. He tried to teach rulers to govern with virtue and ordinary people to act rightly. That world is gone, but not entirely. Human nature has not changed. Selfishness, ambition, fear, and desire still drive behavior. Social order still depends on trust, responsibility, and moral example. This is where Confucius becomes startlingly relevant. Modern societies, even in highly technological and secular contexts, face the same fundamental questions. How should leaders behave? What obligations do citizens owe to one another? How do we cultivate virtue in ourselves and in society? Confucius's answers are not simple, but they are profoundly practical. For example, in leadership studies, the idea that authority is moral rather than coercive mirrors Confucius's principle that a ruler must lead by example. Modern organizational theory often emphasizes ethics, corporate culture, and emotional intelligence, concepts Confucius articulated long before the language of business psychology existed. Education, too, bears his mark. Confucius's insistence on lifelong learning, reflection, and moral responsibility echoes in contemporary debates on holistic education. The emphasis is no longer only on skills or test scores, but on character, critical thinking, and empathy. Confucius anticipated this centuries before modern pedagogy formalized it. Family ethics, another cornerstone of his philosophy, continues to influence billions. Filial piety may look different in contemporary societies, but the principle, caring for elders, understanding intergenerational responsibility, balancing personal freedom with communal duty, remains a vital question in modern life. Confucius's teachings also appear in unexpected places, such as diplomacy. Negotiations often rely on trust, patience, and reputation rather than brute force. Confucius understood this intuitively. He recognized that human relationships are the foundation of stable political and social structures. Another fact worth noting is the revival of Confucianism in modern East Asia. In China, after centuries of suppression, during the Cultural Revolution, Confucian values are experiencing a renaissance. Government and society often emphasize harmony, education, and ethical governance, values drawn explicitly from Confucius. Similarly, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam continue to adapt Confucian principles to modern governance, business ethics, and family life. Even Western scholars and thinkers draw on Confucius to rethink ethics, leadership, and community. His ideas challenge the assumption that morality must be grounded in religion or individualism. Instead, Confucius presents a system where virtue is social, relational, and habitual. Yet Confucius is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Modern critics still warn that rigid application of Confucian hierarchy can reinforce authoritarianism or suppress individuality. His philosophy must be interpreted, adapted, and balanced. This is precisely what has allowed it to survive for centuries. It is flexible enough to be applied contextually. Another remarkable fact is the resilience of his ethical framework. Unlike doctrines dependent on rituals, laws, or sacred texts, Confucianism survives because it shapes how people think, not only what they do. Even when governments reject it, individuals preserve its principles. Moral responsibility, integrity, respect for learning, family loyalty, and the cultivation of virtue endure because they resonate with human experience. Confucius also teaches a crucial lesson about failure and persistence. He died largely unrecognized, politically unsuccessful, and frustrated. And yet, the principles he fought for continued to grow, influencing generations far beyond his reach. This demonstrates that influence is not measured solely by immediate success, but by the longevity of ideas and the lives they transform. Finally, Confucius remains a compelling figure because he combined practicality with aspiration. He never promised utopia. He acknowledged human weakness. He emphasized effort, not perfection. He taught that a life aligned with virtue is challenging, imperfect, and ongoing, but profoundly meaningful. In a world increasingly obsessed with speed, efficiency, and measurable outcomes, Confucius's insistence on patience, reflection, and moral cultivation feels radical. He reminds us that character matters more than position, virtue more than force, and ethical consistency more than immediate success. Confucius is often remembered for his teachings, but the details of his life reveal a man as complex, flawed, and fascinating as any modern figure. These lesser-known facts illuminate why his philosophy feels alive, even centuries later. One striking fact is his humble beginnings. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, in what is now Shandong Province, China. His family was of modest nobility, but fallen on hard times. His father died when he was very young, leaving Confucius to be raised in relative poverty. This early exposure to struggle shaped his worldview. He understood social inequity intimately, not from theory, but from lived experience. He saw firsthand how chaos and corruption hurt ordinary people. Despite poverty, Confucius was obsessed with learning from a young age. He reportedly memorized ancient texts and studied ritual, music, and history with relentless focus. By age 15, he had already set his heart on a life devoted to learning, a commitment he would never abandon. This early dedication demonstrates that his philosophy was grounded in personal discipline, not abstract speculation. Another intriguing fact is his relationship with music. Confucius believed music was a form of moral and emotional cultivation. It was not entertainment for him. The proper melody and rhythm had the power to harmonize society. In fact, he considered music a medium for refining the self and fostering empathy. To Confucius, listening and performing music were ethical acts. A ruler who ignored music risked moral imbalance in society. Confucius was also remarkably mobile for his time. He spent over a decade wandering various Chinese states, offering his counsel to rulers, and seeking a position where he could implement his ideals. These journeys were often perilous. He encountered political intrigue, rejection, and danger, yet he persisted, demonstrating courage and commitment to his principles, even when material rewards were minimal. His teaching style is another fascinating fact. Confucius did not lecture passively. He engaged students in Socratic dialogue, asking questions, challenging assumptions, and encouraging independent thought. He famously said, "I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand." This method emphasized active engagement over rote memorization, a radical idea in a time when education was heavily ritualistic. Another lesser-known fact is his attitude toward personal mistakes and failure. Confucius openly admitted his limitations. He was frustrated when rulers ignored his advice. He failed to implement reforms, despite his best efforts. Yet he never abandoned his principles. He accepted failure as part of moral development, teaching that struggle, reflection, and persistence are central to virtue. Confucius was also deeply attached to his students. He formed close relationships with disciples like Yan Hui, whom he considered exemplary in character. When Yan Hui died young, Confucius was inconsolable, reportedly weeping openly, a rare display of vulnerability. This reveals a man capable of profound emotional depth, not the cold, distant philosopher sometimes imagined. Another fact that surprises many is his diet and lifestyle. Confucius practiced moderation. He avoided indulgence, ate simply, and maintained personal discipline. This was not asceticism for its own sake, but part of his ethical framework. The body must be cultivated as carefully as the mind. Excess weakened character, balance strengthened it. One of the most paradoxical facts is his political ambition coupled with moral integrity. Confucius desired positions of influence. He sought to implement reforms and improve governance. Yet he refused posts under rulers he deemed immoral. He would rather remain poor and marginalized than compromise his ethics. This balance between ambition and integrity defines much of his life and legacy. Finally, Confucius was humble in self-perception. He never claimed infallibility. He encouraged criticism, even from students, and acknowledged when they had a better understanding. Authority for him was not about power, it was about responsibility. This humility made him a teacher, not a dictator, and a philosopher whose ideas endure because they invite engagement rather than impose obedience. Confucius is often remembered as solemn, austere, and serious. But the man behind the philosophy had quirks, paradoxes, and a sense of humor that made him profoundly human. One notable fact is that Confucius loved humor and irony. He occasionally teased his students to provoke reflection. If a disciple boasted about knowledge without virtue, Confucius would undercut them with a wry remark. If another focused on cleverness over morality, he would pose a deliberately absurd question. Humor was a pedagogical tool, a way to awaken critical thinking and humility. Another paradox is that Confucius valued both ritual and spontaneity. He spent his life teaching the importance of rituals, ceremonies, and proper conduct. Yet he also encouraged flexibility and personal understanding. A ritual performed mechanically was meaningless. A ritual performed thoughtfully strengthened character. This duality shows that Confucius valued principle over blind adherence, structure over rigidity. Confucius also experienced profound self-doubt despite his wisdom. Late in life, he lamented that few rulers truly understood or practiced virtue. He feared that his teachings would be forgotten or misinterpreted. Yet this awareness of limitation never led him to despair. Instead, it reinforced his commitment to education, mentorship, and personal cultivation. A particularly human fact is his attachment to music. Confucius not only studied music, but reportedly performed it passionately. He believed music could harmonize emotion, refine character, and even shape moral perception. To him, music was ethical practice, an extension of philosophy into art. This combination of practical ethics and aesthetic sensitivity reveals the depth of his thought. Another paradox is his relationship with power. Confucius desired influence, yet he refused to compromise his principles to obtain it. He served briefly in governmental roles, but often resigned when his ethical standards conflicted with political reality. This demonstrates a rare combination: ambition without moral compromise, a model for ethical leadership even today. Confucius was also relentlessly curious, a trait sometimes overshadowed by his status as an ethical authority. He asked questions, constantly debated ideas, and sought perspectives from students, peers, and historical texts. He did not present a fixed doctrine, he sought understanding. This open-mindedness contrasts with the rigidity often associated with traditional Confucianism. One of the most remarkable facts is his treatment of failure. Confucius failed repeatedly to implement his reforms. He was ignored, resisted, and politically marginalized. Yet he did not give up. He turned failure into teaching moments, both for himself and for his students. Persistence, reflection, and learning from setbacks were central to his philosophy. Another striking fact is his emotional depth. He mourned deeply for his disciples, especially Yan Hui, whose early death devastated him. He expressed grief openly, even when social norms dictated restraint. Confucius balanced emotion with moral discipline, never suppressing feeling, but guiding it toward constructive action. Confucius also displayed a remarkable sense of adaptability. He wandered through different states, adapting to local customs and political conditions, yet never compromising core principles. His approach to life was pragmatic, flexible, yet deeply principled, a paradox that made his teachings both practical and aspirational. A lesser-known fact is his fascination with human behavior. Confucius studied not only texts and rituals, but also people, their habits, motivations, and responses. He observed rulers, ministers, families, and students, drawing universal lessons from everyday interactions. This combination of moral philosophy and acute social observation is what made his teachings so enduring. Finally, Confucius embraced contradiction. He could be ambitious and humble, rigorous and compassionate, disciplined and spontaneous, critical and humorous. These contradictions were not weaknesses. They were the essence of his humanity. By modeling a life of complexity, he taught that moral cultivation is not about perfection, but about continuous effort, reflection, and adaptation. Even after centuries of study, Confucius continues to surprise historians and readers alike. Many aspects of his life and personality are lesser known, revealing dimensions that humanize the legendary philosopher. One fascinating fact is his love for walking and wandering. Confucius did not confine himself to study halls or political offices. He traveled extensively across the Chinese states, often with a small group of devoted students. These journeys were dangerous, through forests, rivers, and territories in conflict, but he treated them as opportunities for observation, reflection, and teaching. Walking, for him, was both physical exercise and mental cultivation, a chance to contemplate morality and governance in real-world settings. Another lesser-known fact is that Confucius respected even minor officials and ordinary people. While he taught rulers and sought continue their moral improvement, he also valued the insights of commoners. He believed that virtue could be found in anyone who made an effort to act rightly. One story recounts how he listened attentively to a low-ranking steward who explained a local dispute, praising the man's practical wisdom. This attention to ordinary people illustrates a fact often overlooked. Confucius saw moral potential everywhere, not just in the elites. A striking lesser-known fact is his approach to wealth and simplicity. Despite having opportunities to accumulate power or riches, Confucius lived modestly. He avoided luxury, ate simply, and emphasized that moral cultivation mattered far more than material success. His personal austerity was not asceticism for its own sake. It was a visible demonstration of his ethics. Wealth, comfort, or status could never replace the disciplined cultivation of virtue. Confucius also had an unusual approach to failure. When a ruler rejected his advice, or a reform failed, he did not become bitter or withdraw entirely. Instead, he reflected on his own actions and encouraged his students to learn from mistakes. One famous anecdote tells of him lamenting the lack of good governance in his state, but continuing to travel, teach, and advise, demonstrating persistence in the face of repeated setbacks. This shows that resilience and moral patience were central to his philosophy, not just theoretical principles. Another lesser-known fact involves his relationship with music and ritual. Confucius did not view music merely as entertainment. He believed that proper music and ritual could cultivate emotions, align moral behavior, and harmonize society. He often played instruments and composed music to teach his students the subtleties of moral expression. To him, music was a method of shaping character and reinforcing ethics, an unusual combination of art and philosophy that is rarely emphasized in summaries of his life. Confucius also had a playful and ironic side. He occasionally made humorous remarks to challenge his students, exposing arrogance or laziness. For instance, when a student bragged about moral superiority, Confucius might respond with a witty paradox or a teasing question, forcing the student to reflect rather than merely assert. These moments demonstrate that Confucius used humor as a tool to teach critical thinking and humility. A lesser-known fact is his deep mourning for students and friends. The death of his favorite disciple, Yan Hui, left him devastated. He openly wept, showing a vulnerability rarely associated with philosophical authority. His capacity for grief illustrates that ethical cultivation did not require suppression of emotion. Instead, Confucius believed in channeling emotion thoughtfully to guide moral action. Confucius also valued curiosity and continuous learning. He admitted when he did not know something, asked questions to deepen understanding, and encouraged students to challenge ideas respectfully. Learning, for him, was not a process of memorizing facts, was the lifelong cultivation of understanding, moral judgment, and insight into human behavior. Finally, one of the most surprising lesser-known facts is his practical approach to ethics. Confucius did not preach abstract ideals, disconnected from everyday life. He believed morality must be applied in relationships, family, governance, and even small daily decisions. The ability to act rightly in ordinary circumstances, he taught, was more valuable than clever philosophical reasoning alone. Confucius is often remembered as a moral philosopher, but one of the lesser-known facts is how deeply engaged he was with politics. He did not write theoretical treatises on governance alone. He tried to advise rulers directly, traveling between states to implement his ideas. Confucius believed that good governance begins with moral example. He argued that a ruler who cultivates virtue naturally inspires citizens to act ethically. One anecdote illustrates this. Confucius once observed a corrupt leader punishing subjects unfairly while indulging in personal luxuries. He reportedly said that such a ruler could never win loyalty through fear or coercion. Only through self-discipline and moral integrity could authority endure. Another key fact is his insistence that merit, not birth, should guide appointments. While Confucius respected hierarchy, he did not believe noble birth guaranteed competence. He sought to place capable and ethical individuals in positions of responsibility, challenging entrenched aristocratic privilege. This principle later influenced the imperial examination system, which allowed individuals of modest backgrounds to attain positions in government based on knowledge and virtue rather than lineage. Yet Confucius faced enormous resistance. His ideas often conflicted with entrenched power structures. Local officials and rulers, motivated by self-interest, resisted reforms, ignored advice, or even treated him with contempt. In one instance, he resigned from office when he realized a ruler would not follow his recommendations. This illustrates another critical fact. Confucius prioritized principle over position. He refused to compromise his ethics for political gain, even when opportunity was within reach. Confucius also emphasized the importance of education for governance. He believed that rulers should be lifelong learners, continuously cultivating moral judgment and practical skills. Similarly, ministers should be trained not only in administration, but in ethical reasoning. He argued that an educated, virtuous bureaucracy was essential for stable governance. A radical idea in a time when power often relied on hereditary privilege. Another lesser-known fact is his concept of moral courage in politics. Confucius taught that ministers and advisors had a duty to correct rulers when they acted unjustly, even at personal risk. Loyalty, he argued, was meaningless if it allowed immoral behavior to continue unchecked. Speaking truth to power rather than blind obedience was a cornerstone of his political ethics. Confucius's political philosophy also included gradual, ethical reform over radical upheaval. He distrusted sudden, imposed changes, believing they often provoked resistance or social disorder. Instead, he emphasized incremental improvement through education, moral example, and institution building. This approach demonstrates his understanding of human behavior. Change is effective when it is internalized rather than forced externally. Yet, despite his insights, Confucius's political career was largely unsuccessful. He failed to implement widespread reforms and spent years wandering between states, often in obscurity. This has led some to label him a failed politician. However, this characterization misses a key fact. Confucius's influence was long-term, not immediate. While rulers ignored him in his lifetime, his students preserved his teachings, which later shaped dynastic policies and governance philosophies for centuries. Another important fact is his focus on ritual in political life. Confucius believed that proper ritual reinforced moral behavior and societal hierarchy, creating stability without reliance on coercion. Ceremonies, etiquette, and protocol were not mere formalities. They were tools to cultivate respect, discipline, and ethical consistency. Finally, Confucius's political thought was deeply relational. He did not reduce governance to laws or systems alone. Instead, he emphasized the quality of relationships between ruler and minister, parent and child, teacher and student. Ethics in politics, he argued, depended on the moral integrity of individuals within these relationships. Without ethical actors, even the most sophisticated systems would fail. Confucius's philosophy is often described as harmonious, orderly, and morally consistent. Yet one of the most fascinating facts about him is the paradoxical nature of his thought, qualities that make it both enduring and challenging. First, Confucius valued hierarchy and equality simultaneously. He believed social roles were essential. Rulers, ministers, elders, and children each had responsibilities. Yet he also insisted that moral capacity was not fixed by birth. A low-born individual could cultivate virtue and become a worthy leader, while a noble could fail ethically. This tension between social order and moral meritocracy is central to understanding Confucian thought. Structure exists, but it is justified by ethical behavior rather than inherited privilege. Second, he emphasized ritual and spontaneity. Rituals structured society, taught discipline, and cultivated virtue. But Confucius warned that ritual performed mechanically without understanding was meaningless. True morality required both respect for tradition and reflective judgment, rigor tempered by insight. This balance makes his teachings flexible, allowing them to adapt across cultures and centuries. Another paradox lies in his relationship with authority. Confucius sought positions in government to implement reforms, yet he refused to serve immoral rulers. He valued influence, but not at the cost of principle. This demonstrates that moral integrity can coexist with political ambition, a tension that modern leaders still grapple with. Confucius also balanced emotion and discipline. He grieved openly, laughed with students, and appreciated music, yet he maintained strict personal ethics. Emotion, for him, was not a weakness, but a force to guide moral action. This human dimension contrasts sharply with the often austere image of him in textbooks. A surprising fact is his approach to failure. Confucius's life was full of setbacks. Ignored by rulers, politically marginalized, and unable to implement many reforms. Yet he persisted, teaching, reflecting, and refining his philosophy. He demonstrated that influence is not measured solely by immediate success, but by the longevity and impact of ideas. Failure, properly understood, becomes a tool for growth and teaching. Another paradoxical aspect is his focus on both the individual and society. Confucius believed ethical self-cultivation was primary. One had to refine one's own character before improving the world. Yet he also taught that morality is relational. One's virtue manifests in family, community, and governance. Personal development and social responsibility are inseparable in his philosophy. Confucius also exhibited humility alongside authority. He acknowledged his own limitations, encouraged students to challenge him, and admitted when he did not know something. Yet he commanded respect because of his insight, discipline, and ethical example. Authority derived from virtue, not coercion, a concept still strikingly relevant today. A lesser-known paradox involves tradition and adaptability. Confucius revered the past, studied ancient texts, and valued established rituals. Yet he encouraged interpretation, reflection, and practical adaptation. He did not worship the past blindly. He used it as a guide, not a constraint. This tension allowed Confucianism to survive, evolve, and remain relevant for millennia. Finally, Confucius's thought reconciles aspiration and realism. He aimed for moral excellence and good governance, but never promised perfection or utopia. He recognized human flaws, political limitations, and the inevitability of failure. His philosophy is therefore both inspiring and attainable. It calls for effort, reflection, and integrity, rather than miraculous transformation. These paradoxes, order and merit, ritual and insight, ambition and principle, emotion and discipline, individual and society, tradition and adaptability, make Confucius's philosophy dynamic, resilient, and endlessly interpretable. To understand why Confucius's philosophy endures, it is essential to explore how his ethical concepts, Ren, benevolence, Li, ritual, propriety, and Xiao, filial piety, translate into practical guidance for everyday living. Ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness, is the cornerstone of Confucian ethics. But Ren is not merely an abstract virtue. It manifests in action and relationship. Confucius believed that human interactions define morality. To practice Ren, one must show empathy, kindness, and consideration in daily encounters. A merchant treating customers fairly, a parent guiding a child patiently, or a ruler governing with fairness, all are expressions of Ren. A lesser-known fact is that Confucius considered small acts of goodness as significant as grand gestures. Morality begins in ordinary choices, not in heroic deeds. Li, ritual, propriety, or proper conduct, extends this ethical practice into social and ceremonial life. Confucius argued that ritual is a framework for ethical behavior. From greetings and meals to state ceremonies, the way one acts shapes character and maintains social harmony. One interesting anecdote is that Confucius would correct even minor lapses in decorum among students, not to enforce blind obedience, but to instill attention, respect, and mindfulness. Ritual, therefore, is ethical training. It aligns behavior with moral intent. Xiao, filial piety, emphasizes respect and care for one's parents and ancestors. Confucius saw family as the foundation of society. The home is the first arena of moral cultivation. Respecting elders, caring for parents, and honoring family traditions teaches responsibility, empathy, and continuity. A lesser-known fact is that Confucius also believed filial piety required balance. Blind obedience was not virtue. Care combined with moral discernment was the goal. Children were expected to guide their elders toward ethical conduct when necessary, demonstrating that Jiao includes wisdom as well as reverence. Together, these three principles form a practical ethical system. Ren provides moral direction, Li structures action, and Xiao roots ethics in relationships. They are not abstract ideals, but actionable practices. Confucius's genius lies in showing how everyday behavior, how we speak, eat, greet, and care for family, reflects and shapes moral character. Another lesser-known fact is Confucius's emphasis on mutual responsibility. Ethical behavior is relational. One acts rightly, not only for oneself, but for others. A teacher guides students. A ruler protects citizens. siblings respect each other. Moral cultivation is therefore inseparable from social engagement. This relational focus distinguishes Confucius from many Western philosophers, who often emphasize individual autonomy over collective responsibility. Confucius also taught that consistency matters more than perfection. People will inevitably fail, make mistakes, and act selfishly. What counts is ongoing effort, reflection, and correction. Daily life becomes a laboratory for moral practice, forgiving wrongs, maintaining honesty, and practicing humility. A key fact here is that Confucius celebrated small victories in ethical effort. Progress, however incremental, was meaningful. A fascinating anecdote illustrates this. When a student asked how to become virtuous, Confucius replied that it begins with being attentive in small matters, greeting friends sincerely, treating family respectfully, and performing daily duties conscientiously. Moral development is cumulative. The ordinary habits of life build the foundation of ethical character. Another lesser-known aspect is his integration of self-cultivation with societal impact. Confucius believed that by refining oneself, one naturally benefits the wider community. A virtuous official stabilizes government, a conscientious parent strengthens family, a principled merchant fosters fairness in commerce. Ethics is both personal and social. Finally, Confucius's ethical concepts remain relevant today because they are actionable, adaptable, and human-centered. Ren, Li, and Xiao do not require belief in a deity or adherence to rigid rules. They demand reflection, empathy, and integrity, qualities applicable across cultures and eras. Modern leaders, educators, and citizens can practice these principles in daily life, illustrating that Confucius's wisdom transcends time and geography. One of the most enduring facts about Confucius is the transformative effect of his philosophy on education. He is often called the first teacher because he radically redefined what it means to learn. In his time, education was largely reserved for the elite and focused on memorization or vocational skills. Confucius, however, emphasized moral cultivation alongside knowledge. He believed that education should be inclusive. Students from different social backgrounds, abilities, and temperaments could learn if they were sincere and willing. This principle laid the groundwork for meritocratic ideas that would later influence the imperial examination system in China. Under this system, government positions were awarded based on knowledge of Confucian texts and ethical understanding rather than birth or wealth, a revolutionary concept in ancient society. Confucius's educational philosophy was also relational and participatory. Teachers were responsible not only for transmitting knowledge, but for shaping the character of students. Students, in turn, were expected to engage actively, reflect on teachings, and practice virtue. Learning was not transactional. It was a lifelong moral endeavor. Another fact is Confucius's profound influence on governance. He argued that rulers must govern by virtue, not by force or fear. Authority derived from moral example, not coercion. A virtuous ruler inspires loyalty and ethical behavior in citizens. This principle shaped governance throughout East Asia for centuries, particularly under the Han Dynasty, which institutionalized Confucianism as the ideological foundation of the state. Even when rulers misapplied his teachings, Confucius's philosophy continued to influence administration. Officials were expected to practice self-cultivation, uphold justice, and prioritize societal welfare. Confucianism became the moral backbone of bureaucracy, emphasizing integrity, education, and accountability. Confucius also left a profound mark on social structures. His teachings reinforced family values, respect for elders, and social harmony. While some criticize this as conservative or patriarchal, It also created stability in societies that experienced frequent conflict and upheaval. The emphasis on reciprocal duties between parent and child, ruler and subject, teacher and student established a framework for social cohesion that persisted for millennia. A lesser-known fact is that Confucianism influenced law and ethical norms without relying solely on codified statutes. Moral conduct was expected to guide behavior, and education, ritual, and self-reflection supplemented legal systems. This reliance on ethical cultivation over punishment illustrates the subtle power of Confucius's ideas. Social order arises from internalized virtue rather than external coercion. Confucius's impact on international cultures is also remarkable. His teachings spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where they influenced governance, education, and family structures. Each society adapted Confucian principles to local traditions, demonstrating the flexibility and universality of his philosophy. Even today, Confucian values shape business practices, political ethics, and interpersonal behavior across East Asia. Another fascinating fact is how Confucian principles intersect with modern leadership theory. Concepts like servant leadership, ethical governance, and the cultivation of emotional intelligence echo Confucian ideas. A leader is effective not only because of skill or authority, but because of moral example, reflection, and relational awareness. Confucius anticipated insights that modern management and political theory would only articulate centuries later. Despite criticisms that Confucianism sometimes reinforced hierarchy or suppressed individualism, the philosophy remained resilient and adaptive. Its core ethical teachings, Ren, Li, and Xiao, provide guidance for personal conduct, community relationships, and statecraft alike. Its adaptability allowed it to survive political upheavals, revolutions, and social transformations, remaining influential in both traditional and modern contexts. Confucius' teachings, while celebrated, have also been the subject of controversy and criticism, both historically and in modern times. Understanding these debates reveals deeper facts about his philosophy and its enduring relevance. One major criticism is that Confucianism can reinforce social hierarchy. By emphasizing duties according to one's role, ruler, minister, father, child, critics argue that it discourages equality and can legitimize authoritarianism. Indeed, in historical contexts, rulers and elites sometimes used Confucian ideology to justify rigid hierarchies and social control. However, a lesser-known fact is that Confucius himself emphasized moral responsibility of those in power. Authority was a duty, not a privilege. Misuse of power was morally condemned, showing that the system is not inherently oppressive but depends on ethical application. Another criticism targets gender roles. Traditional Confucian societies were patriarchal, and women's rights were often restricted. Confucius said relatively little explicitly about women, but later interpretations imposed strict gender hierarchies. It is important to note, however, that Confucius's core principles, Ren, Li, Xiao, are not inherently gendered. They emphasize moral cultivation, empathy, and responsibility, which can be applied universally. The historical restrictions on women were social, not philosophical, constraints. Confucianism has also been criticized for promoting conformity over individuality. Rituals, respect for tradition, and hierarchical relationships could, in practice, suppress innovation and personal expression. Yet Confucius distinguished between blind conformity and reflective practice. Rituals performed without understanding were meaningless. Ethical reflection and critical thinking were central to his teachings. This subtlety is often lost when Confucianism is rigidly institutionalized. A lesser-known fact is that Confucius valued questioning and debate. He encouraged students to challenge ideas, reflect critically, and think independently within the moral framework he proposed. Ethical cultivation was not passive. It required active engagement. The tension between societal norms and personal judgment is therefore a deliberate aspect of his philosophy, not a flaw. Modern interpretations of Confucius also grapple with relevance in contemporary life. Critics argue that his focus on hierarchy, ritual, and duty seems outdated in democratic, egalitarian, and secular societies. Yet many scholars and leaders find practical wisdom in his principles. Ethical leadership, social responsibility, lifelong learning, and empathy remain essential across cultures. Confucius's stress on relationship-based ethics anticipates modern discussions about organizational culture, corporate social responsibility, and civic virtue. Another fascinating fact is that Confucius's philosophy is interpretively flexible. Neo-Confucians in later centuries reinterpreted his ideas through metaphysics, psychology, and ethical theory. Modern scholars reinterpret them in light of human rights, democracy, and global ethics. This adaptability explains why Confucian thought can be both ancient and contemporary, rigid and flexible, personal and political. A critical debate also concerns ritual and morality. Critics argue that emphasis on li, ritual, can prioritize form over substance, creating superficial morality. Yet Confucius explicitly warned against ritual without sincerity. He argued that the intention behind action mattered more than ceremony itself. This highlights a key fact. Confucius distinguished between external compliance and internal moral cultivation, a nuance often overlooked in historical applications. Another important point is that Confucianism encourages ethical patience and incremental reform. Critics sometimes see this as passivity. Confucius preferred steady moral improvement over radical upheaval, valuing long-term cultivation over immediate results. In practice, this can appear conservative, but it also emphasizes resilience, prudence, and foresight, qualities essential for personal and societal stability. Finally, the controversies surrounding Confucius reveal that his teachings are living ideas, not fixed doctrines. They provoke debate, inspire reinterpretation, and adapt to changing cultural, political, and social contexts. Far from being irrelevant, the criticisms themselves demonstrate the continued vitality and engagement with his philosophy. Confucius is often portrayed as a distant, solemn sage, but closer examination reveals a man full of quirks, habits, and personal traits that make him deeply human. These lesser-known facts bring his philosophy to life. One intriguing fact is his love for simplicity and routine. Confucius preferred a modest lifestyle, eating simple meals and wearing plain clothes. He believed that moral cultivation depended on self-discipline and clarity, not indulgence or luxury. Yet he also appreciated beauty, in music, in nature, and in proper ceremony, balancing austerity with aesthetic awareness. Confucius was also deeply attached to his students. He maintained personal relationships with disciples like Yan Hui, whom he admired greatly. When Yan Hui died young, Confucius openly mourned, demonstrating vulnerability and emotional depth rarely associated with legendary philosophers. This attachment shows that teaching, for Confucius, was more than instruction. It was mentorship, friendship, and moral companionship. Another lesser-known fact is his love of music and ritual as ethical practice. Confucius believed music could harmonize emotions and cultivate moral sensitivity. He played instruments, composed music, and used ritual as a means of teaching moral reflection. This illustrates a remarkable integration of art, ethics, and education, long before such interdisciplinary thinking was common. Confucius also had a wry sense of humor. He occasionally teased students to provoke reflection or expose arrogance. For example, when a student boasted of moral superiority, Confucius might respond with irony or a paradoxical question, forcing the student to reconsider assumptions. Humor was a pedagogical tool, emphasizing critical thinking and humility. A fascinating fact is that Confucius embraced failure as part of moral development. He failed repeatedly in political office, often ignored by rulers, yet he continued to teach and refine his philosophy. Failure, he believed, was not shameful, but an opportunity for reflection and growth. This approach to adversity demonstrates his resilience and practical wisdom. Another intimate fact is his habit of self-reflection. Confucius reportedly spent time daily reviewing his actions, questioning whether he had been sincere, fair, and conscientious. Moral cultivation, for him, was an ongoing, disciplined practice, grounded in observation of one's own behavior as well as the world around him. He also valued observation of human behavior. Confucius studied rulers, citizens, students, and families, extracting lessons from ordinary interactions. He believed that understanding human motives and social dynamics was essential for ethical guidance. This attentiveness to human nature informs much of his philosophy and demonstrates its practicality. A lesser-known fact is his flexibility and adaptability. While committed to principle, Confucius adjusted his teaching methods to his students' abilities and contexts. He did not impose rigid formulas. He sought understanding through dialogue, questions, and personalized instruction. This flexibility contributed to the endurance of his teachings. Confucius also valued personal integrity over fame or material reward. He resigned positions when rulers acted immorally, chose a modest life over wealth, and accepted marginalization rather than compromise. This unwavering commitment to principle became a central feature of his ethical model. Finally, Confucius's human traits, humility, humor, attachment, reflection, adaptability, and emotional depth, demonstrate that his philosophy is not abstract theory. It is rooted in lived experience, modeled by a man who struggled, loved, taught, failed, and persisted. This personal dimension makes his teachings relatable, practical, and enduring. After over 2,000 years, Confucius remains one of the most influential thinkers in human history. Understanding the full scope of his life, philosophy, and character allows us to see why his teachings continue to resonate across cultures, societies, and eras. One of the most striking facts is that Confucius' influence transcends geography. While he lived in ancient China, his ideas spread to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and beyond. In each culture, his emphasis on ethics, education, and social harmony was adapted to local customs. Confucius' teachings proved flexible enough to endure political upheavals, revolutions, and social transformations, yet consistent enough to retain their core moral insights. Another key fact is his impact on education. Confucius was the first to teach a system that combined moral cultivation with intellectual study, accessible to students from diverse social backgrounds. His idea that education develops character, as well as knowledge, laid the foundation for meritocratic principles, lifelong learning, and ethical pedagogy, concepts that continue to influence modern education worldwide. Confucius's ideas on governance and leadership, are equally enduring. He emphasized that rulers and officials must act ethically, govern by example, and prioritize the welfare of the people. Modern leadership theory echoes these principles in concepts like servant leadership, corporate responsibility, and moral accountability. His insistence that authority is a moral obligation rather than a privilege remains relevant in contemporary politics and organizations. A lesser-known fact is the longevity of his ethical framework in everyday life. Principles like Ren, benevolence, Li, ritual, and Xiao, filial piety, are not abstract ideals. They guide behavior in family life, education, social interaction, and governance. Confucius demonstrated that morality is relational, practical, and rooted in daily choices. Small acts of kindness, respect for others, and conscientious behavior are expressions of enduring Confucian ethics. Confucius's personal life also reinforces his legacy. His humility, emotional depth, perseverance, and humor model the qualities he taught. He experienced poverty, political failure, and social marginalization, yet remained committed to ethical cultivation. His life shows that philosophy is not only about theory, but about living with integrity in a complex, imperfect world. Another remarkable fact is the adaptability of Confucianism. Critics have labeled it hierarchical or rigid, yet the philosophy's core principles, ethical cultivation, relational responsibility, and practical wisdom, allow reinterpretation and application in vastly different historical and cultural contexts. This flexibility explains why Confucius' ideas survive, not as static dogma, but as living guidance for moral reflection and social organization. Confucius also challenges modern society with enduring questions. How should leaders act ethically in positions of power? How do we balance personal ambition with moral responsibility? What role do family, community, and ritual play in shaping ethical behavior? How do we cultivate virtue in daily life amidst complexity and imperfection? By confronting these questions, we see that Confucius is not a distant historical figure, but a guide to navigating contemporary ethical dilemmas. His teachings remind us that virtue, reflection, and relational responsibility are timeless tools for living well. Finally, one of the most important facts is that Confucius's philosophy is not about achieving perfection, but continuous improvement. He emphasizes effort, reflection, and integrity, rather than instant success or absolute correctness. This makes his wisdom both practical and aspirational, accessible to everyone, regardless of status, culture, or era. In conclusion, Confucius's life and teachings reveal a thinker who combined practical ethics, political insight, educational innovation, and deeply human qualities. From humble beginnings to enduring global influence, he exemplified how moral cultivation, ethical reflection, and relational responsibility can shape both individual lives and societies. Confucius is not merely a figure of history. He is a timeless teacher whose lessons continue to guide, challenge, and inspire. His legacy reminds us that living ethically, cultivating virtue, and caring for others are not outdated ideals, but essential practices for a just and harmonious world. And so, from his life of wandering, teaching, and reflection, we inherit not just a philosophy, but a blueprint for living a meaningful, moral, and human-centered life, one that continues to resonate, adapt, and endure over 2,000 years later.